Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on how the DAC rules are changing and why you should care. My name is Åsa Thomasson, and I will be moderating this session. While participants are filing into the webinar, we're going to give it a couple of minutes to make sure that everyone is in the meeting. While you are connecting to the webinar and connecting to the audio, it would be great if everyone who's joining and who want to connect to the other event participants, if you could possibly tell us, say good morning or good day or good afternoon or good evening, depending on from where in the world you're joining this seminar, in the chat. So please go ahead and use the chat if you want to, and to say hello and to tell everyone from where you're joining this webinar. And that way we will have something to keep us busy while we wait for the quite large number of participants who signed up for this webinar. So please feel free to use the chat as you like, and just say good afternoon or good morning and tell us where you're joining from. Okay. I would like to say that this webinar is being recorded. So please take note of that. And this recording will, of course, be available on Development Initiative's YouTube channel and website after the event. So you will be able to share it to others as well. You will be able to use the chat during this meeting. You will be able to use the Q&A function to post your questions. As always, please use all the chat functions in an appropriate and respectful manner. The DI engagement team are on the call. You can find them there. So if you need any technical assistance or any other assistance, or you want to get in touch with the organizer, you can always chat also directly to the engagement team. The questions asked through the Q&A function will be prioritized. We have quite a long time for discussion. So while we're listening to the panelists, please make sure to take note of your questions or to start asking your questions in the Q&A function. There's also a new function in Zoom, which is that if someone asks a question and you think, yes, that's the question I wanted to ask, I really want that question answered, you can look at the Q&A box and give a like to the questions that you also want answered. And that way, we will be able to prioritize more easily among the questions. As a moderator of the session, I will read out the questions, unless you would like to read your question yourself. Then just at the end of your question, put like in person or something, and then the engagement team can unmute you and you can ask your question yourself. It will also be possible to just raise your hand in the ordinary fashion. You touch the raise hand function, and then you will, once you get the word, you'll be unmuted. And you will be able to ask your question in person. But please note the questions asked through the Q&A function will get priority when we ask the questions. But towards the end, if there are more people and you have questions occurring to you and you would just like to raise your hand and ask them, that is perfectly fine as well. Okay, so without further ado, because we really want to give quite a long time for questions and answers. There are At the moment, there are 57 attendees in the call, and we can see in the chat that people are joining from all over the world. It's great to see civil society and others coming together from all around the world to learn more about this, because development cooperation, as you all know, is sorely needed in this extremely serious global situation in which we see growing inequalities and growing effects of climate change, growing conflict, national, international. You all know this, and I'm sure you're already working on it, but development cooperation and how much it is and what we use it for has never perhaps been as important as it is right now. So even though the topic of this webinar can seem technical, not everyone working on day-to-day development programs or other specific thematic policy issues are faced with DAC rules every single day in their work. And yet it is incredibly important for how all the high-income countries in the OECD Development Assistance Committee, how they are living up to international commitments and how they are living up to this ODA modernization process that has been ongoing and discussed ever since 2015 or even longer, but it was definitely a commitment in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Development Finance, and it has had a number of steps since then. And what we hope to be talking about today is one of the final steps of this long process of ODA modernization, which has been agreeing on all the different rules that we'll hear about in a minute on the private sector instruments. And I think without further ado, once again, taking time to, and I hope you all are too, taking time to say that we're delighted that so many people have joined from so many different places and so many different types of organizations as well. So I will, without further ado, give the word to Nerea Craviotto, Senior Policies Advisor at Eurodad. And she will be giving us really this whole overview of the recent changes that are being agreed. The final decision is not formally made yet, that are being agreed in the OECD DAC, and hopefully also be able to, because Eurodad as a network has been very active in this process, to give an overview of what kind of opportunities for CSOs advocacy do these new private sector instrument rules bring in terms of risks, but also in terms of opportunities of strengthening the transparency, accountability, and even the quality of aid. So after Nerea, we will have the opportunity of listening to Yuan Ritchie from Development Initiatives, who is a senior policy specialist, and he will be talking a little bit about going in depth and giving you some concrete examples so that you really understand how these new rules are looking, what are the modalities of measuring private sector instruments and the contributions from them, and what are the implications of there being two different ways of measuring them, because that is the agreement that donors can do this in two different ways. And what does that mean in practice for development, the official development assistance measure. Okay, so handing over directly to Nerea, who will tell us what new reporting rules for private sector instruments. What is next, Nerea?
Thank you, Osa, and thank you everyone for joining us. And I hope I'll continue seeing many of you in the coming months and year in monitoring what is going to happen with ODA and this private sector instruments thing. Okay. These buttons are not working. Why? Technical problem, sorry. So I'm going, because I don't know if it's the connection. Can you hear me? Yeah. Because the computer.
We can hear you.
The computer not responding. Ah, okay. Now.
Attempt to double. Yeah, perfect.
Thank you. Sorry for that. So basically, the content of the presentation is gonna, first of all, be a bit of giving you a highlight on the new reporting rules for the private sector instruments, and yeah, it's more like highlights and a quick overview. And then I will share some analysis on the PSI ODA from 2018 and 2021, and what I've been identifying there as gaps in terms of reporting from DAC members. And then the last part would be about some suggestions on what CSOs and other actors critical about development cooperation could do going forward with these new rules. I thought I would quickly present, I'm gonna just reduce it so I can see that. Just quickly here is so the discussions and negotiations on private sector instruments, they fit in the process of ODA modernization that starts in 2012 with different aspects, including introducing the grant equivalence methodologies for sovereign loans. It's also later came with the debt relief, but just to focus on the private sector instruments, maybe the key milestones for these negotiations are 2016, where there is a mandate to explore how to report them into ODA, and maybe it's at the high-level meeting of the DAC in 2016, where there is an intention to move ODA from concessionality to additionality, because recognizing that private sector instruments are not could not be concessional by nature, then there was already an intention to start to question the issue of concessionality for in the context of private sector instruments. So that was the first very important move in terms of leaving the fundamental criteria of ODA, that is concessionality. There was a first temporary agreement in 2018 that allowed the reporting of private sector instruments for 2018. This has been a temporary agreement. And it was considered a temporary because they couldn't agree on many aspects on the implementation, and notably on how to calculate grant equivalence for the different instruments into consideration, but also safeguards. And these temporary rules have been the one that donors have been following since 2018 and applies to 2021 and 2022. And all going well, which I think is going pretty well. Not that I'm happy with it, but this is how it is. Probably most likely next week on Tuesday, there should be the adoption of the new package for the private sector instruments. And with this new package, what we have is a set of rules on how to report new instruments into private sector under the umbrella of the private sector instruments. With grant equivalence, and yeah, I will say more maybe in the next slide. And the adoption of the agreement means that 2023 ODA data for PSIs these rules would apply. Yeah. And in terms of highlights, as I was already saying, with this agreement, this is the very first formal step towards replacing concessionality with additionality, recognizing that by nature those instruments cannot be concessional. And for those that are not familiar with the concept of concessionality, this basically is a fundamental principle that other resources that are channeled through development cooperation to the global south must offer something more general than terms that are offered by the market. And thus, for example, it speaks a lot on the context of loans, equities, etc., etc. And this has been done in a moment where countries across the global south, what they are more asking in different development forums is that what they need the most is concessional funding. And here, I mean, I think really time will only tell what Pandora's box, because I do think that opening concessionality to additionality, it's opening a Pandora's box that might allow the donor community to put anything they want into ODA. We don't know yet, but it's to be seen. But it looks to me a little bit like opening a Pandora's box here. When we see also the trends of development cooperation towards the private sector. There is also the expansion of the eligibility of ODA to new private sector-oriented instruments like guarantees or mezzanines. And for mezzanines, I was not very familiar with this before I start to work on this, but it's a sort of hybrid of debt and equity financing. There is also the new agreement is a step to report PSI operations in grant equivalents, and this with the aim to ensure coherence within the whole statistical system, and notably with sovereign loans that were since 2018 reported on in grant equivalence, and this with a quite generous methodology that contributes to further incentivize this private sector-oriented agenda that is being driven by DAC donors in the last years. And what worries me the most in this sense is to see in the years to come a stampede of donors going into benefit generating ODA, because all those instruments channeled through these private sector vehicles like DFI, they generate profits. And we might see more and more appetite to go into that type of development cooperation than the more traditional cooperation based on grants and programs in the global south addressing key areas for poverty and inequality eradication. And maybe just on the point of coherence, I mean, yeah, there is more coherence with this agreement in terms of applying grant equivalence everywhere, but still within the instrument itself, for how to report private sector instruments, there is still an incoherence on how institutional, there are two approaches for private sector instruments. I don't know how familiar are, but very quickly. I know some of you are already, so that's why I want to go very quickly. But there is an institutional approach where basically the donor just communicates the transfer that it's been made to the PSI vehicle, let's say a DFI. And the instrument approach, what the donor reports is the grant equivalence of the different operations, being guarantees, mezzanines, loans, equities. There is also only a small portion. So for the incoherence that still remain then is that for the institutional approach, there is a one transfer to the PSI vehicle that it's reported on cash flows, and then for the private sector, for the instrumental, we still are with the grant equivalence. And the way that is being justified with the new agreement is that both, whether donors applying on institutional or instrumental, both they will need to still report on one or the other for ensuring comparability. But I know Iwan is going to cover much more better than me and more in detail in that. But I think it's important to still mention that there is lack of coherence. Just not to be on the negative, but there are also, I think, something important to acknowledge, and that is a positive step with this agreement, is that there's been an important step towards establishing a set of safeguards and reporting mechanisms on how private sector instruments are behaving, and the numbers and the impact towards the global ODA levels. Plus, there is a review in 2030 that should reinforce transparency and accountability around these PSIs operations. But yet, I mean, and we will see more with the data that will follow after. This will only happen if members deliver on the requirements they are setting for themselves. And what we see from the analysis of 2018 to 2021 data is that there are a lot of gaps in what the DAC members are reporting to the OECD. A disappointing element, though, on the safeguards front is that, and I know there were some members in the room that were in support of such a safeguard, is that there has been no mechanism to prevent inflation of ODA with the profits generated by these private sector instruments. And so basically what will happen in the years to come, and maybe not immediately, but will happen in the next 5, 6, I don't know, is that with the current rules that will be approved in 1 week, the profits that are generated by the PSI operations can be reinvested in the PSI vehicle, let's say the DFI, and be reported again as ODA. So basically, especially under the instrumental approach, donors can be making one capitalization of the DFI, and then the DFI generates profits, and then continue to reinvest them in development cooperation, and then this continues to be reported as ODA, and it can go endless because there's no ceiling to cap for how long a donor can make that, which is gonna generate other inflation, in the sense that there would not be donor budgetary effort, state budgetary effort to mobilize this ODA. So it's basically profit making, and that might.
Nerea, can I interrupt you very quickly, because we got a very good quick question in the Q&A, which is what is meant exactly by additionality? So I'm sure there has to be more people in the call that are not familiar with that term. So could you explain quickly what is meant with additionality in this context?
Yeah, additionality in this context is that if the operation can prove to be financially additional, so able to mobilize additional funding, supporting the private sector actor to mobilize additional funding that would from other private sector actors or other public actors, that would justify the additionality of this operation. And then the other additionality aspect is value additionality, and it's like the donor through this operation, it's bringing expertise, technical expertise, or there is an opportunity to focus specifically on, for example, creating, putting the accent on, for example, strengthening women's economic empowerment through this operation that would then show value additionality. So that goes beyond concession.
Exactly. And maybe people are joining.
The problematic thing with additionality is it's actually that can be open to any sort of interpretation. There's not much agreement actually within the DAC community itself beyond this very short definition on what exactly is additionality, which is problematic. Sorry, Osa.
Yes. No, just I think that was a good explanation. And for those who are not from a country where there is a development finance institution, many of the development finance institutions are maybe development banks from donor countries or public companies who are doing their investments for profit. And that would, in the old DAC rules, exclude them because you can't do things. The definition of ODA before private sector instruments was that it has to be concessional. It has to be a grant, a gift, or it has to be a gift-like element of a loan, like the portion that makes the loan cheaper, so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Osa. To go back to the concept of ODA inflation that we might see in the context of private sector instruments, notably under the instrumental approach, but not only. What I wanted to say is that this can be particularly problematic in the context of some countries like the UK or Sweden, where the ODA budget is capped by law. Because in this context, what we can see is the profits of private sector operations replacing budgetary efforts from the state towards the target of 0.7. Or for example, in the context of France and Spain that recently have set themselves a calendar to reach the 0.7, through this profit generating ODA, they can more quickly reach these targets with lower budgetary efforts behind. And then last but not least, what I do expect, I would imagine it's going to happen in the years to come, is that the PSI ODA levels will be increasing. There are many reports already mentioning that there is intention from some member states to increase their PSI ODA, and yeah, and I think this agreement will contribute to that. I think I'm a bit late, so I will, in terms of figures, I will try to maybe go quickly on this. What we have seen in between from the analysis of data of PSI ODA data, what we have seen between 2018 and 2021 is that the amount of ODA reported as private sector instruments has been mostly growing. And between 2018 and to 2025 to 2021 at a rate of 18%. The accumulated PSI ODA has been of 20.6 billion. That's gross. And since 2018, the levels of ODA channel through private sector instruments have been stable at an average of 0.3% of total ODA levels. However, what this rather stable average mass is that when you go into detail for what is happening in certain countries, what we see is that for some donors, PSI has been increasing a lot between 2018 and 2021, and that has been the case for Japan, France, Germany, and Sweden. Maybe the most striking one is with Japan. And here, so between 2018 and 2021, there have been 15 DAC members reporting on PSI ODA out of 22 or out of 32, and these plus the EU institutions, with 4 members: the UK, the EU, Germany, and France, concentrating almost 80% of the total PSI ODA. And what we have observed as well is that at least 85% of the PSI ODA was channeled through development finance institutions, and here you have the list of the ones that I've been able to identify in the creditor reporting system. That is the system where donors report their aid statistics. In terms of where PSI ODA is going, where data is available, and this is just for 40% of the total PSI ODA reported for the 4 years. So the rest, in some cases, we have countries, regions, so there is one problem in terms of information gaps, but where the data is available, a vast majority of the PSI ODA is going to upper middle income countries at an average of 59%, followed by lower middle income countries, 37%, and only 4% goes to LDCs. And what these figures confirm is that the profit-seeking nature of PSI operation that is mostly directed to the countries and regions that offer the lower risk and secure profits behind. And maybe where the information gaps are more present, it's actually on additionality. And from the analysis of the data for 2018 and 2021, what I'm seeing is that the DAC members are failing to report the information that they require for themselves on additionality, notably, which is the primary criterion for private sector instruments for ODA to be eligible. And it's with the new agreement that will be agreed next week, the official replacing of concessionality. And there, with additionality, is where they are lagging most behind. And that omits crucial information to assess whether actually ODA is effectively allocated according to where it's most needed and whether it has an impact. Here, the table, what it shows is that although the situation it's been improving, still an average of 30% of the reported PSI ODA did not include any information at all on the type of additionality, so not whether it was financial or value additionality or both. So we couldn't know actually then what was the justification for the operation at all. And this was particularly the case for the EU institutions in Denmark and Germany that did not provide such information for more than half of their PSI ODA. Also, PSI ODA reported under the instrumental approach hardly contains any additional information in text justifying the type of additionality pursued and why it is relevant. It was better under the institutional approach, much more better actually. And for example, in the case of Germany, Spain, and Switzerland, they did not report any additional information on the type of additionality pursued. And that was followed by France. And also, DAC members need to provide information on what are the development expectations of those operations, and also that would justify also the operation and why it is additional. And again, for most under the instrumental approach, the most of the data was not available, and with again EU institutions, Germany, Spain, and Switzerland reporting no information at all. And here again, considering that the new PSI agreement will formalize additionality as a defining character for PSI operations and replacing concessionality, it is highly concerning how poorly DAC members are reporting on these additionality aspects, and it needs to be improved on the way forward. How much time do I have, Rosa?
Yes, it would be good to wrap up, I think. So 1 minute?
2? This is my last one, but it's That is
Yeah.
what roles can be civil society play, civil society and other critical actors play on the way forward. I think it's very important to maintain the spotlight on the need for non-PSI ODA and concessional ODA out there, and continue to hold DAC members accountable for their long-standing commitment to provide 0.7 of ODA in concessional terms. We should be continuing questioning the move towards additionality. The agreement will be taken next week. It's done. But we should insist that if these operations cannot offer a better condition than those of the market, then why they should be reported as ODA, and continue question, shouldn't they be reported somewhere else? Isn't it other financial floors? Is it TOSSD? But I think even if it's the agreement is made, we need to continue questioning this move towards additionality. Also call on governments to provide evidence that justify the inclusion of PSIs in the ODA and to justify the impact and the results. Also continue defending the integrity of ODA by monitoring PSI operations and the roles of DFIs within, and notably on the impact of it. And then an important point, I think it's especially for those organizations that do monitor, do track and provide reports about, is to monitor the potential inflation of ODA, exactly with what I was explaining before about the profits generated by these operations being reinvested, so tracking. And the good thing about this new agreement is that the levels of information that the donor community will need to provide are much higher, and if they deliver on that, it would allow for such a monitor from the AWatch community. For us to continue to develop evidence and analysis that contribute to inform discussions on the impact of PSIs and their support for various types of private sectors in the Global South. And my last call here would be to call for a definitive end of the ODA modernization process and the expansion of the concept of ODA to activities that do not belong to ODA. And I'm saying that because, I mean, yes, there is an agreement that is going to be taken next week. There would be a press release. There would be a mention in the high-level meeting on the 15th of November. But I know already there are some instruments that couldn't fit right now in the negotiations that are already in the pipeline for 2024. And one example is, for example, bonds. There was a try in the current negotiations. It couldn't work because there was no mandate in the 2016 HLM, but some members were very unhappy with that, and they will continue pushing for that. And again, I mean, this opening the ODA to additionality also opens up a Pandora's box that nobody knows what can bring into ODA. So I think we should call very strongly for a definitive end of the ODA modernization process. Sorry for delay, and thank you to everyone.
Okay, thank you very much, Nerea. While we get you and Richie, policy specialist at development initiatives, highlighted here, I would just like to sum up, and I've seen a lot of questions. I'm really happy we're getting questions, so we're going to try to get to the questions directly after the presentations. But some of the implications that you summed up, Nerea, was implications for the very commitments that donors have given to ODA, and if this is then transferred to public development finance institutions, but that work on market terms and generate profits, are donors shying away from their commitments to provide this concessional finance? The whole additionality question, is it enough that it's new money being brought in through private investments, and how do you make sure that that investment wouldn't have been made already at market terms, so to speak? ODA inflation, as you say, with the lack of transparency and the risk of reinvesting. the impact and the importance of CSOs monitoring that. That was a really good point as well to try and highlight, because the PSI discussion has been so full of details and the rules and the discount rates, and it becomes a lot of focus on detail. And sometimes we forget the bigger picture, where it's also important to follow up and really see, compared to other potential uses of development cooperation funding, is this the most effective ways to use it in each investment, and the important role of civil society to really look at all of development cooperation and assess the impact that it's having. Okay, we'll get back to that later. And now I would like to invite Ewan, who's going to run us a little bit more through what these changes in the rules, because it is a big change, as Nerea was saying. It is really taking a step back from one of the basic definitions of ODA, which is concessionality in a sense. And also this has been one of the most difficult points to reach an agreement on. It's been very heated discussions at times in the Development Assistance Committee, and donors have very different ideas about how these rules should look, and the different institutions look very different. And so in the end, they could not agree on one single way to count these contributions. And they ended up sticking with two different models of reporting, the institutional approach and the instruments approach, as Nerea said. So now we're going to hear from Ewan, who really looked into some examples of it. What does this mean for the comparability between donors, between years, etc.?
Yes, thanks. Can you hear me okay? We're all good. Fantastic. Yeah, thanks very much, Ossa, and for everyone for coming. So yeah, as mentioned, I'm going to be sort of diving into some of that detail between, what these methods and what they imply about the comparability between donors. And I would say, right at the beginning, this was a difficult exercise because there's not a lot of, there's not enough data out there at the minute. And one potential benefit of these new rules is that they do require donors to provide more information. So, so there are lots of problems with new rules, in my opinion, but that is at least one benefit, that it is going to require donors to report more. So before diving into the detail, I just want to make one quick point that Nerea touched on as well, and that's that DFIs make money. Now, that's not a bad thing. Where there are opportunities to both foster development and also make a financial return, then they should be taken, of course. But ODA is supposed to be a measure of donor effort, and donor effort is usually interpreted as some measure of sort of fiscal sacrifice or budgetary expenditure. And it's hard to it's hard to maintain the idea that there's donor effort with transactions that are making as much money as, for example, Norway's sovereign wealth fund. So there was this really interesting article from Development Today that found that Norway's DFI was making about as much money as Norway's sovereign wealth fund. So that's not a bad thing, and it's not a criticism of Norfund, but it is hard to square with its inclusion in a measure of donor effort. And one of the reasons that the DAC say they want to include this is to remove the disincentives for using these instruments. But it's kind of hard to see what these disincentives are when donors are making a substantial return. And in fact, including it in a measure which also has pure grants that you obviously don't get back again, if anything, there's maybe too much of an incentive to use PSIs relative to other forms of ODA. So I won't go into too much detail here. This has been, Nerea touched on this as well, but essentially, by far the simpler method is the institutional one, where ODA is counted on its way into a DFI, and then capital and profits are subtracted when they're repatriated from the DFI. There is a coefficient on these measures if not everything the DFI does is ODA eligible, but in principle, these coefficients are usually 100%. So this is similar to the way that we measure multilateral contributions, and it has this feature that some sort of grant equivalent will emerge over time. And that's because if a DFI is making more concessional transactions on average, then on average, it will lose more money than if it was less concessional, and therefore it will need more frequent capital injections. And so over time, for a given level of investment, more concessional DFIs will end up recording more ODA overall. So that's institutional. The instrument method, very simple to state. It tries to measure the grant equivalent of each PSI transaction. And I should say, as Nore mentioned as well, most PSIs come from development finance institutions. But the details get very thorny with the instrument method. And the DAC say that these two methods should equate over time. And I hope to convince you that that is definitely not the case. The instrument method will almost always produce more ODA. So I won't dwell on this, but I just want to sort of put up these quotes from the DAC, because I think they illustrate a sort of tension with the instrument method, which is that it's essentially trying to measure something that doesn't exist. So PSIs are non-concessional in nature because, we don't want to be too distortive of markets by producing, giving big subsidies. But the grant equivalent is intended to measure how concessional a loan is. So if it's not concessional, then properly speaking, there isn't really any grant equivalent. And this isn't just a mere technicality. A grant equivalent is supposed to measure the expected losses on a transaction, essentially. But there aren't any losses on these transactions on average, and therefore, you get this situation where, as Maria said, you get profits and you can reinvest them over and over again, scoring ODA on the same money that you're spending, basically, to record infinite ODA essentially over time. And the way they do this is basically by having, essentially this boils down to having unrealistically high discount rates in working out these transactions. Now, a lot has been said about discount rates in the context of public sector loans. So I'm not going to go too much into depth, but I'm going to try and really quickly talk through a very simple example where basically a DFI gives a loan of $100 as a 5% interest rate. Now, if the default risk on this loan is 5% per year, then the expected value of this loan will be zero, because the repayments and the interest charge will roughly offset, on average, the expected losses, and therefore, the DFI won't earn any money, but it will still have that 100 at the end, on average. And yet, if you measure that with a discount rate which is higher than the risk, then you'll end up scoring, well, if this is using the 10% discount rate, which the DAC uses for LDCs, then you'll end up with a grant equivalent of about $20, even though you still have that money. So do this 5 times and you've earned the same amount as if you'd given a grant originally in ODA. And that would be possible if the discount rate accurately reflected risk. And for those sort of financially minded, I'm sort of ignoring the time value of money just for the sake of illustration, but the same would apply just with slightly different figures. So what are the instruments in the instrument method? I mean, the most important ones by far are equity and loans. I'm going to mainly focus on equity because that's where the biggest changes are coming. With loans, the issues are very, very similar to the issues with public sector loans. Guarantees kind of borrow their payment structure from the underlying transactions. Make much sense sort of talking through that in much more detail, but I will touch on the end because that's one of the newer elements being introduced. And then there's some stuff which is kind of a combination of equity and loans, things like mezzanine instruments and so on. So I'm mainly going to focus on equity in the interest of time, and I think it illustrates some of the problems quite well. So how does it work with equity? Well, there are 2 separate methods. And the issue really that the DAC has here is that the grant equivalent is supposed to be, it's supposed to basically be a discounted cash flow model. So you look at the cash flows you think you'll receive, and then you discount them with an appropriate discount rate. But with equity, you don't know what the future cash flow is going to be. And so the way the DAC have got around that with the ex-ante method is basically to look at the average return on the portfolio in the 10 years prior to that investment, and then pretend that investment was a lump sum loan. So you just send your money out, get it all back again at the end. If there's like a big difference between that grant element and the grant element that you'd get if you calculate it on the 10 years prior to exiting, then there'll be an adjustment. But that's essentially it. The ex-post method is very similar to the cash flow method, which we're currently using, where the outflows count as positive ODA, but then the reflows are subtracted. But instead of just subtracting the reflows as we do right now, the DAC discounts those reflows. And just to be clear, this is saying that after the reflows have been received by the DFI, the DAC then adjusts the reflows for the risk that they won't be received. That's essentially what's happening, which I believe seems a strange thing to do. I mean, these reflows have already been received, so there's no longer any risk associated with those transactions, but they are nevertheless adjusted for risk all the same. And then finally, if total ODA on a portfolio is negative, then it will be adjusted to bring it back up to 0, which is another issue which has been quite controversial. So I'm going to talk for a really sort of really contrived and quite simple example here, but just to sort of try and give an illustration of this kind of effect whereby a little bit of capital can just generate ODA forever, basically. And so this simple example, a donor puts $100 into a DFI in year 0 or year 1990, I've put 2020 there. So and invests in an equity, and then each year they get repaid on that investment. They don't earn a return, they just get their money back, and then each year they reinvest that. So it's really easy to see what the ODA would be under the institution method. It's they put the 100 in at the beginning, and then at the end they get 100 back again. So on average, it's 0. However, with the instrument method, and this is the ex-ante one here, well, the way they calculate it, there's a grant equivalent of there's a grant element of 9.5%. So each year they count, nearly $10 against ODA. So if you play it out for 20 years, then at the end you have a little bit shy of $200 according to the instrument method and 0 according to the institution method. And you could let that play out for 20 more years, and the difference between these measures would just keep growing. And this is really important because most of these DFIs have been in operation for many years already. So they've already built up lots of capital and don't really need any more in order to keep making investments. And that just shows the ex post happens to equate in this scenario, but I'll show that it doesn't always in a slide or two. So that was a really contrived example. This is me trying to demonstrate it with a sort of real world example. So this is British International Investment, the UK's DFIs. It's been operating since 1940 something. I could only find data as far back as 1989. So I'm just going to pretend that the capital that they had then was paid in 1989. And if you compare rough estimates for BAI of ODA under the institutional method and the instrument method over this period, well, over this period from 1989 to 2014, BAI didn't receive any more capital injections. It has since, but it doesn't change your overall story. So over this period, if you assume that they don't repatriate the capital yet, then ODA measured by the instrument method would be somewhere between 2 and 4 times what it would be under the institutional method. And that's because by 2014, 3/4 of British international investments capital was from retained earnings. So, the money it's made in previous investments. It doesn't need any more capital to continue its operations. And this is where, this sort of DFIs basically become kind of perpetual ODA machines where, it can just sort of keep on generating ODA from its same resources, and the two measures diverge over time. Another real world example, I'm not going to expect everyone to sort of go into all of these numbers, but basically this is from Norfunds this time, and in their 2022 reports, they give the equity investments that they've exited from in that year, and that gives us a really good indication of, that gives us enough information to know what it would have been, how it would have been scored under the cash flow method and the ex post method. So how it would work at the minute is that it would be 20 million Norwegian kroner. That's under the cash flow, where you basically subtract the reflows from the original disbursements, but then cap each individual transaction so that none of them are scoring negative ODA. And that gets you 20 million. However, under the ex post method, all of those reflows are discounted at that risk-adjusted discount rate, and therefore the ex-post method becomes 7 times higher about. So instead of 20 million at the minute, it's about 140 million. It's a little bit trickier to get the ex-ante because you'd need to know what the return was over the last 10 years. But if you just base it on the information that we have from these equities and assume it was similar, then with the ex-ante, you get another figure again of 189 million. And so this is suggesting that basically we have 3 separate ways of measuring the same thing, and they're all quite different, and they're all much higher than what we used to do. So just to get the institution method, if you assume then that these were the only investments made by Norfund and they repatriated all the profits, then to get the overall ODA, you basically subtract the profits, and the picture's the same, but obviously all the figures are negative because Norfund has done quite well from these investments on average. So this is just to say that it's really hard to kind of compare donors that are using these different methods, because they just give totally different results, and those differences will only increase over time. The last thing I'm going to quickly talk about is guarantees. Now, as I mentioned, this is the one area where these are activities that were simply not included at all, and now they are, and so that has given some concern to whether that's going to lead to ODA inflation as well. I personally think there is some argument for including guarantees in ODA. I mean, if it is a measure of donor efforts, then they do assume some risk, and they might have to pay out. But the one thing that's really important is that if you're including an estimate of the risk of guarantees, like the DAC are proposing to do, then it will not make sense to include the additional finance when those guarantees are actually triggered, because that would be double counting a risk, which is what we do for debt relief already. I think one thing that would be interesting to see is if that proposed to do that and count the risk at at both ends at the same time. So the ODA impact is probably going to not be that big. Some estimates from an ODI paper found that most DFIs, the proportion of guarantees in their portfolio is quite small, the exception being the US, but they haven't reported any any PSIs currently, so it will be sort of interesting to see how that transpires. But I would say Proparco has increased it in recent years, and so it was about 380 million in 2022. If that's sort of broadly representative, then this will probably be adding hundreds of millions to ODA rather than billions, so probably quite a small percentage increase, but it is nevertheless something to watch when the figures get published. And the press release is talking about this fantastic increase in ODA. Is this just stuff that's been relabeled, or is it is it a sort of genuine new effort? So I'll end there. So yeah, the main takeaways for me is that the 2 methods, contrary to what the DAC has stated, will not give the same methods. Leave it long enough, the instrument method will always be higher. And I think if I was going to put my cards on the table, I'd say for that reason, I think the institutional method makes more sense. It avoids so many of these sort of thorny measurement issues. The fact that we don't know the terms for equity transactions, it makes such a big difference what the discount rates are and so on. Anyway, but either way, it looks like these changes are going to allow a lot more ODA to be scored than is currently, and there is an incentive problem here. If you can score $100 of ODA with a grant that you'll never see again, or if you can score $100 of ODA on a $100 loan that you'll get back again in a couple of years, even if PSIs are a good thing, and it's, we want donors to be taking those opportunities, do we want that to be happening at the expense of grant financing? And I think most of us would probably argue no. So yeah, these are the things that I think this incentive effect will probably mean that we see more and more PSI in the future, and that's me. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ewan. This has been, we've heard some of the very same issues that we heard with Nerea, that these rates on which you're counting PSIs are too generous, and that's causing problems. We're hearing that there are not comparable results from sort of how you count the same type of transaction, essentially, depending on which method that each donor and each development finance institution chooses to use. The potential of this meaning some increase in the ODA reported and inflation of ODA. And there was also some reflections on sort of what donors will choose that I think were really interesting. And I think that that is something to really look for, especially at times of economic difficulties in many of the economies, also in donor countries. It's incredibly tempting, instead of using public funds, which official development assistance is supposed to be, to try and find different private money. So a lot of very valid and interesting points. We have a lot of questions from participants. So I actually would like to, some of them have already been answered, but I have, let's see which ones are not answered yet. Oh, I had one question regarding this. There was a question on transparency in Germany, Spain, and Switzerland not sharing this information. And you were talking about preferring the instrument method, Ewan, because it provides a much more fair result, so to speak. But previously, there's also been criticism towards the institutional method for transparency.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. And I think one of the important things, just to clarify, so my preference was for the institutional reason. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
But no, I think it is one of the really valid points that's been made about the institutional mechanism. I'm hoping that with the new rules that the DAC has introduced, where they have said that you have to provide information on both types, so donors that report on the institutional methods are going to need to provide information on instruments, and also vice versa. I think that maybe takes the sting out of that criticism a bit, because essentially all information for both approaches should now be there, and it's just a case of what gets counted towards the aggregate. That also has the benefit that people like me that think one measure is a fairer measure than the other, I can just ignore the instrument approach. So I do think that this is one of the really sort of beneficial things that's come from this process, is that, you know, the DAC is saying that they're going to require donors to report on both. So it's a valid point on the, but it's one that I hope, you know, these new rules will rectify.
Okay, so that's the one plus on this new rules, that they do require donors to actually provide the same information independently of which sort of reporting method that they use. But will all that be available at the same time, or may there be delays depending on one or the other? Do we know that?
I guess delays.
Will everyone be required to report?
There's a 2 years transition period. I haven't read the latest, maybe it's one, but I think it's 2 years transition period, I think. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, after that, I think it will probably come out at the same time as the sort of underlying, you know, the low-level CRS data. So you'll have the press release in April. I don't think that'll include enough detail. So it'll be the sort of later, more detailed release where this comes out, I imagine, anyway.
Mm. We have one open question that hasn't been answered yet about whether the data available on additionality at OECD level, why is there so little data available? And is there more? I mean, my understanding is there isn't so much data available on many of these because of business secrets, etc. But why might there be so little data available on additionality, and can that change to for the better now with the new rules? Maybe, Maria, do you want to?
I somehow replied. I mean, I don't have an answer. I think part of the problem, but I don't say it's the whole problem, is that the government is responsible for reporting to the OECD, while DFIs, they don't report to the DFI, are not responsible for reporting to the OECD. So what happens is that the DFIs, they produce their own information for their own accountability and transparency reasons, towards their own constituency in the country, but that this information doesn't move to the government in order that the government uses to the OECD, to the OECD. So I guess there is some homework to do in terms of strengthening the channels of communications between the two. And then, yeah, I don't know how to put pressure on the DFIs on that sense. And yeah, but
Absolutely.
it might be just part of the problem. There are other issues on transparency that are more related with the terms of the operations, the interest rates. These are who are the actors involved. This information often is not shared because confidentiality reasons. And there, I think there's also an area where we should put pressure, and we should know who is involved, whether there is state aid at risk. True that most of the operations target lower middle income countries and upper middle income countries that are not in the scope of the recommendation on aid and timing, but still maybe it's time in the current development financial architecture to review also the entire recommendation.
Mm-hmm. And it might be interesting mentioning that Publish What You Funded, the new Aid Transparency Index specifically on development finance institutions quite recently, and most of them scored not great, especially, well, on the transparency issue. So that's a good resource also for civil society to use for the DFI in your country, worth checking that out. I have a question from Samantha Attridge, who sort of raised her hand in the Q&A box quite early. So I'm wondering whether the engagement team could unmute and pin Samantha so she can ask her questions. Samantha, are you there? No? Okay. Let's move on then to the next question.
Just to say quickly on DFI transparency, I think I did see that Paul James was here from Publish What You Fund. I think I saw him during the attendees, so no pressure whatsoever, but just, yeah, if you wanted to say anything more about that, then feel free, basically.
No. Are we having trouble unmuting participants, or maybe people have stepped out to take another call? Let's see if there are any other questions that weren't answered completely. Let's see. I think the question from Lucas Shogo on the whether the provisional flows will be sort of revised in the future, that was answered by Ewan's presentation, right? Was there any other things that were unclear there?
If not, then yeah, I mean these new rules are intended to replace the provisional method. Yeah, so yeah,
indeed. Okay, are there any? I think most of the questions were answered in writing. Are there any other questions you would like to raise your hand and ask a question about these new rules? Otherwise, while we wait, maybe Nerea, you would like to expand a little bit about what you were saying about sort of opening up this potential Pandora's box, and if you would like to answer that as well, Ewan, because you said at the end of your presentation, Nerea, that you wanted to sort of, that one of the key asks of civil society should be to say, well, this should be the end of this modernization process that has essentially been going on for 10 years and maybe 7 or 8 intensively. So, and why do you think that is an important demand? What is the risk? What might be opening up?
My worries is that, I mean, the ODA agenda is going into a direction that is more and more about catalyzing resources from the private sector, and this cannot be done with grants. This is about private sector oriented operations, and this is about private sector instruments, guarantees, loans, equities, and role of DFIs. So there is a trend in there where also the donor community is vetting. So my worry is that more and more resources will be channeled to this type of operations because they generate profit, and then they don't even need to mobilize resources from the budget, state budgets, and still say that they are contributing towards this international commitment that was 0.7. So my worry is that more and more ODA would be deviated to these kind of operations, and there were less and less resources available for grants. I mean, you want to say very, very, very clearly. I mean, there should be resources for grants rather than loans and other type of private-oriented instruments. And so yeah, for me in the near future, it is very important also to as civil society to look at what is happening with grants. What is the impact of this new agreement on private sector instruments on the between the share of grants grants and PSIs and sovereign loans. I think this monitoring and making the case that the challenges across the global south are still so big, being in meeting the sustainable development goals, being addressing the conflicts, humanitarian crisis. I mean, the challenges are still too big to divert all the ODA from what is more needed. So my worry is a lot along those lines, and on the contrary, what I'm hearing, and it's rumors, and I don't know exactly what is going to happen, but what I'm hearing is, yes, the bonds, they couldn't be agreed right now, but that are still in the pipeline. There were discussions 2 weeks ago in Marrakesh during the annuals about instruments such as hybrid capitals that might come to Paris. What is why the DAC community wants to discuss hybrid capitals in Paris? We don't know yet, and so it can the expansion of the PSI umbrella can continue on and on unless there is a strong call to say, okay, now it's time to concentrate on ODA as we used to know it, because it's less and less what we used to know, and in targets less and less what should be targeting.
Okay, and just to complete there, Yuan, because many of these DFIs are basically investors or financial institutions that, and some of them have other missions as well, aside from development investing, and some of them also have capital from non-donors. How does that influence their work?
Yeah, it's a great point, because I mean, I expect, you know, with the instrument method, where those transactions are being funded in part from the donor government and in part from other investors, but it's all being attributed to the donor government. So, you know, it's another way in which it's you know, there's sort of more credit being taken for these transactions than is maybe warranted. Just to come back on Ray's, I mean, on an ODA modernization point, because I think it is really interesting. I mean, I guess it's been going on since, I think you could argue that it was since we started talking about it being a measure of donor effort rather than anything which is actually sort of, you can concretely define in statistical terms. And it's, you know, it's made it quite easy to shift the goalposts. And I think, you know, for me, it's not like this stuff isn't important. I do think we should be trying to mobilize private sector resources. I think maybe the issue is that there's just such a massive focus on ODA, and you know, no one talks about other official flows, for example. And I think even though it's got loads of problems, in my view, initiatives like TOSSD and other things, you know, maybe that's you know, a direction whereby we can talk positively about some of the things that donors are doing which are not ODA, so that they feel less need to stuff everything that they're doing into ODA. That's, you know, my 2 cents.
Okay. We are, oh, there we are. I've just realized that Paul James has indeed raised his hand. Sorry, but I do want to, because we've reached our time almost, so I do also want to call everyone's attention to the survey that's going to pop up on your computer very shortly as an end of webinar poll. So please don't forget to answer that before you leave. But let's hear what Paul James from Publish What You Find had to say about the previous question.
Thank you, Asa. I think I would just add that when it comes to transparency, as noted, our DFI Transparency Index found particularly low levels of transparency amongst bilateral DFIs in particular. DFC from the United States was the best performing and scoring 38.2 out of 100, and EDFI institutions performed particularly poorly, ranking between 34.5 and 16.5 out of 100. On the issue specifically around the transparency or the disclosure of additionality, just 2 points really. Firstly, what we found on a project-by-project basis was typically very vague statements around additionality. These would be along the lines of similar finance is not available elsewhere. We found no evidenced claims of additionality. So the bar was particularly low where any transparency was found, and it certainly wasn't evidenced. And slightly more broadly on that point, there was quite an important paper a number of years back now by Paddy Carter, who I believe at the time was with PGD, but is now with British International Investment, which makes the point that actually additionality is near impossible to prove in most cases. And the fact that it's so difficult to prove raises a real question about whether that should replace concessionality. Concessionality is quite a clear concept. You can take a market rate and you can prove that the rate being offered is in some manner cheaper or indeed really is a grant. When it comes to additionality, it's a much more difficult concept to prove, and replacing one with the other seems to be lowering the bar significantly.
Indeed, it's very hard to prove that something wouldn't have happened in the absence of your investment, so to speak. Okay, we have reached, sadly, the end of our time for this webinar. I think that some main takeaways for everyone is that there are, now that we've reached the end of the negotiations on this private sector instruments, there will be increased opportunities to monitor and to get this information about your country's DFIs, about what other countries' DFIs are doing in your country, et cetera, et cetera. So there will be more opportunity to monitor and to ask questions and to make sure that the investments are actually being done for development impact. So please do that. And if I just you have our contact details here for both our experts, for Nerea, for Ewan, for myself. If you have any questions, you can ask. And maybe I'll just take 30 seconds each for Ewan and Nerea. If there was just one thing you could say to participants, what should they be adding to their plans the coming years that has to do with monitoring private sector instruments? What should they be looking for example, in the ODA releases? Ewan.
So yeah, it's a good question. I think for me, I don't think that these figures are coherent or make sense, and I think we should sort of acknowledge that in the analysis that we're doing. So, like I said, I think that the institutional method makes much more sense. And I think it makes sense to, when we're looking at the sort of donor effort or ODA transactions, we're consistent, so that we're not kind of privileging donors that have sort of dodgy reporting methods. Ideally, I think it would be fantastic if we'd all sort of rally around a better alternative, and I know that some organizations have suggested things. I'll leave it there.
Okay. And Nerea, what do you think that everyone should be on the lookout for in their work next year?
I would simplify a lot. I think it's ensuring that countries across the global south continue receiving concessional finance, and that donors are up to the commitment they made 50 years ago, and that the resources that they reach out, they have the quantity they committed to and the quality. And maybe private sector doesn't fit there. It's not concessional. And maybe something looking forward to make some noise about is the International Conference on Financing for Development in 2025. What do we want to bring there for international public finance?
Okay.
Thank you.
Great end to the webinar, and I hope everyone filled their survey. Thank you all for joining.